Chapter 1. Finally, Chapter 1. Yeah, ceiling fan's very quiet. The rabbit had been run over minutes before. Its pink eyes were glazed and blood stained its clean white fur. Unnaturally clean fur, for it had just escaped from a bath. It still smelt faintly of lavender water. A tall, curiously pale young woman stood over the rabbit. Her night-black hair, fashionably bobbed, was hanging slightly over her face. She wore no makeup or jewelry, save for her enameled school badge pinned to her regulation navy blazer. That, coupled with her skirt, stockings, and sensible shoes, identified her as a schoolgirl. A nameplate under the badge read Sabriel, and the Roman VI and gilt crown proclaimed her to be both a member of the sixth form and a prefect. The rabbit was unquestionably dead. Sabriel looked up from it and back along the bricked drive that left the road and curved up to an imposing pair of wrought iron gates. A sign above the gate, in gilt letters of mock Gothic, announced that they were the gates of Waverley College. Smaller letters added that the school was established in 1652 for young ladies of quality. A small figure was busy climbing over the gate, nimbly avoiding the spikes that were supposed to stop such activities. She dropped the last few feet and started running, her pigtails flying, shoes clacking the bricks. Her head was down to gain momentum, but as cruising speed was established, she looked up and saw Sabriel and the dead rabbit and screamed, "Bunny!" Sabriel flinched as the girl screamed, hesitated for a moment, then bent down by the rabbit's side and reached out with one pale hand to touch it between its long ears. Her eyes closed and her face set as if she had suddenly turned to stone. A faint whistling sound came from her slightly parted lips, like the wind heard from far away. Frost formed on her fingertips and rimmed the asphalt around beneath her feet and knees. The other girl, running, saw her slightly tip forward over the rabbit and topple towards the road. But at the last minute, her hand came out and caught herself. A second later, she had regained her balance and was using both hands to restrain the rabbit, a rabbit now inexplicably lively again, its eyes bright and shiny, as eager to be off as when it escaped from its bath. "Bunny!" shrieked the young girl again, as Sabriel stood up, holding the rabbit by the scruff of its neck. "Oh, thank you, Sabriel. I heard the car skidding. I thought—" She faltered as Sabriel handed the rabbit over. The blood stained her expectant hands. "He'll be fine. What is it? Jasoneth? Jasoneth. He'll be fine, Jasoneth," Sabriel replied wearily. "A scratch. It's already closed up." Jasoneth examined Bunny carefully, then looked up at Sabriel. The beginnings of a wrinkled fear showed back up in her eyes. "There isn't anything under the blood," stammered Jackenneth. "What did you—" "I didn't," snapped Sabriel. "But perhaps you could tell me what were you doing out of bounds?" "Chasing Bunny," replied Jackenneth, her eyes clearing as life reverted to a more normal situation. "You see—" "No excuses," recited Sabriel. "Remember what Miss Umbre said at the assembly on Monday?" "It's not an excuse," insisted Janet. "It's a reason." You can explain that to Miss Umbre, then." "Oh, Sabriel, you wouldn't. You knew I was only chasing Bunny. I'd never have come out." Sabriel held up her hand to mock defeat and gestured back to the gates. "If you're back inside within 3 minutes, I won't have seen you. And open the gate this time. They won't be locked till I go back inside." Jasoneth smiled. I keep changing her name. Jackineth, Jasoneth. Jackineth, where were we? Jackineth smiled, her whole face beaming, whirled around and sped up the drive. Bunny clutched against her neck. Sabriel watched till she had gone through the gate. Then, let the tremors take her till she was bent over shaking with cold. A moment of weakness, and she had broken the promise she had made both to herself and her father. It was only a rabbit, and Jackineth loved it so much. But what would it lead to? It was no great step from bringing back a rabbit to bringing back a person. Worse, it had been so easy. She had caught the spirit right at the wellspring of the river, and had returned it with barely a gesture of power, patching the body with simple charter symbols as they stepped from death to life. She hadn't even needed bells, or the other apparatuses, of the necromancer. Only a whistle and her will. Death and what came after death was no great mystery to Sabriel. She just wished it was. Let me get a drink here. Still sounding good? Everything sounding good? Okay, seems alright. Good for now. It was Sabriel's last term in Waverly. The last 3 weeks, in fact. She had graduated already, coming first in English, equal first in music, third in mathematics, seventh in science, second in fighting arts, and fourth in etiquette. She had already been a runaway first in magic, but that wasn't printed on the certificate. Magic only worked in those regions of Alestier close to the wall, which marked the border with the Old Kingdom. Farther away, it was considered to be quite beyond the pale, if it existed at all, and persons of repute did not mention it. Waverly College was only 40 miles from the wall, had a good all-round reputation, and taught magic to those students who could obtain special permission from their parents. Excuse me. Okay, thank you. Sabriel's father had chosen it for that reason. When he had emerged from the Old Kingdom with a 5-year-old girl in tow to seek a boarding school, he had paid in advance for that first year the Old Kingdom's silver deniers that stood up to surreptitious touches with cold iron. Thereafter, he had come to visit his daughter twice a year, at midsummer and midwinter, staying for several days on occasion, and always bringing more silver. Understandably, the headmistress was very fond of Sabriel, particularly since she never seemed troubled by her father's rare visitations, as most other girls would be. Once, Miss Umbre had asked Sabriel if she minded, and had been troubled by the answer that Sabriel saw her father more than when he was actually there. Miss Umbre didn't teach magic, and didn't want to know any more about it other than the pleasant fact that some parents would pay considerable sums to have their daughters schooled in the basics of sorcery and enchantment. Miss Umbre didn't want to know how Sabriel saw her father. Sabriel, on the other hand, always looked forward to his unofficial visits and watched the moon tracing its movement from a leather-bound almanac which listed the phases of the moon in both kingdoms and gave valuable insights into the seasons, tides, and other ephemera that were never at any one time on both sides of the wall. Abhorrent sending of himself always appeared at the dark of the moon. How would you guys like to see a quick look at the map, just so you know what we're talking about? I don't know how well you're going to see this, but let me see here. Okay, right here is the college. Oops, right there. That's the college. And there's the wall, that long wall, and then there's the old kingdom. So they're here in Ancestor on this side of the wall. So just to give you an idea. Okay. So Abhorrent sending of himself always appeared at the dark of the moon. On these nights, Sabriel would lock herself into her study, a privilege of the sixth form. Previously, she'd had to sneak into the library. Put the kettle on the fire, drink tea, and read the book until the characteristic wind rose up, extinguished the flame, and put out the electric light and rattled the shutters. All necessary preparations, it seemed, for her father's phosphorescent sendings to appear in the spare armchair. Sabriel was particularly looking forward to her father's visit that November. It would have been his last, because college was about to end, and she wanted to discuss her future. Miss Umbre wanted her to go to the university, but that meant moving further away from the old kingdom. Her magic would wane, and parental visitations would be limited to actual physical appearances, and those might become even less frequent. On the other hand, going to the university would mean staying with some of the friends she had virtually all her life. Should be a no in there, right? Some of her friends she'd had virtually all her life. Yeah. Girls she'd started school with at the age of 5. There would also be a much greater world of social interaction, particularly with young men, of which commodity there was a distinct shortage around Waverly College. And the disadvantage of losing her magic could possibly be offset by the lessening of her affinity for death and the dead. Sabriel was thinking of this as she waited, book in hand, half-drunk cup of tea balanced precariously on the arm of the chair. It was almost midnight, and Abhorrent hadn't appeared. Sabriel checked the almanac twice, and had even opened the shutters to peer out through the glass at the sky. It was definitely the dark of the moon, but there was no sign of him. It was the first time in her life that he hadn't appeared, and she felt suddenly uneasy. Sabriel rarely thought about what life was really like in the old kingdom. But now old stories came to mind, and dim memories of when she lived there with the travelers. Abhorsen was a powerful sorcerer, but even then... Sabriel! Sabriel! A high-pitched voice interrupted her thought, quickly followed by a hasty knock and a rattle of the doorknob. Sabriel sighed, pushed herself out of her chair, caught the teacup, and unlocked the door. A young girl stood on the other side, twisting her nightcap from side to side in trembling hands, her face white with fear. "Olin!" she exclaimed. "What is it? Is Susan sick again?" "No," sobbed the girl. "I heard noises behind the tower door, and I thought it was Rebisi and Ela having a midnight feast without me. So I looked." "Oh, Rebis. I'm sorry." "What?" exclaimed Sabriel, alarmed. "No one opened the doors in the middle of the night, not this close to the old kingdom." "I'm sorry," cried Owen. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know why I did. It wasn't Rebis or Ela. It was a black shape, and it tried to get in. I slammed the door." Sabriel threw the teacup aside and pushed past Olin. She was already halfway down the corridor before she heard the porcelain smash behind her, and Olin's horrific gasp at such cavalier treatment of good china. She ignored it and broke into a run, slapping on the light of the switches as she ran towards the open door of the west dormitory. As she reached it, screams broke out inside, rapidly crescendoing to a hysterical chorus. There are 40 girls in the dormitory, most of the first form, all under the age of 11. Sabriel took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway, fingers crooked in the spell-casting stance. Even before she looked, she felt the presence of death. Oh wow, no, I haven't. Thank you. I've never ever considered anything like that. I've always been very insecure about my reading because I grew up with a lisp and my whole life, and a lot of kids gave me shit when I was in school, and that was kind of like the one thing I didn't like to do was read in front of the class, and here I am reading in front of you all. So, it's that's sometimes just how life works, But no, I've never thought of anything like that. Person of many talents, thank you, MP. Yeah, it's only been like a month or two, hasn't it? Yeah, it's not been long. Cavalier treatment. Yes. Cavalier treatment of good china. Okay. Even before she looked, she felt the presence of death. The dormitory was very long and narrow, with a low roof and small windows. Beds and dressers lined each side, and at the far end the door led to the west tower steps. It was supposed to be locked inside and out, but locks rarely prevailed against powers of the old kingdom. The door was open, and an intensely dark shape stood there, as if someone had cut a man-shaped figure out of the night, carefully choosing a piece devoid of stars. It had no features at all, but the head quested from side to side, as if whatever its senses did possess worked in a narrow range. Whatever senses it did possess worked in a narrow range. Curiously, it carried an absolute mundane sack in one four-fingered hand, a rough woven cloth in stark contrast of its own surreal flesh. Sabriel's hands moved in a complicated gesture, drawing the symbols of the charter that... Hold on. That intimidated sleep. Sorry, it was cut off there. That intimidated sleep, quiet, and rest. With a flourish, she indicated both sides of the dormitory and drew one of the master symbols, drawing all together. Instantly, every girl in the room stopped screaming and slowly subsided back to their bed. The creature's head stopped moving, and Sabriel knew its attention was now centered on her. Slowly it moved, lifting one clumsy leg forward, swinging. I'm sorry. Slowly it moved, lifting one clumsy leg and swinging it forward, resting for a moment, then swinging the other a little past the first. The lumbering, rolling motion that made an eerie shuffling noise on a thin carpet. As it passed each bed, the electrical lights above them flared once and went out. Upside down. This was way before Stranger Things. Sabriel let her hands fall to her side and focused her eyes to the center of the creature's torso, feeling the stuff of which it was made. She had come without any of her instruments or tools, but that led to only a moment's hesitation before she let herself slip over the border into death, her eyes still on the intruder. The river flowed around her legs, cold as always, the light gray and without warmth, still stretched to an entirely flat horizon. In the distance, she could hear the roar of the first gate. She could see the creature's true shape clearly now, not wrapped in the aura of death which it carried to the living world. It was an old kingdom Desian, vaguely humanoid, but more like an ape than a man, and obviously only semi-intelligent. But there was more to it than that. When Sabriel felt the clutch of fear as she saw the black thread that came from the creature's back and ran into the river. Ooh. Somewhere beyond the first gate, or even further, that umbilical rested in the hands of an adept. As long as that thread existed, the creature would be totally under the control of its master, who could use its senses and spirit as it saw fit. Something tugged at Sabriel's physical body, and she reluctantly twitched her senses back to the living world, a slight feeling of nausea rising in her as a wave of warmth rushed over her death-chilled body. "What is it?" said a calm voice close to Sabriel's ear. An old voice, tinged with the power of charter magic. Miss Greenwood, the magistrix of the school. "It's a dead servant, a spirit form," replied Sabriel, her attention back on the teacher. It was halfway down the dorm. She single-mindedly rolled one leg after the other, still single-mindedly rolling one leg after the other. Without free will, something sent it back to the living world. It's controlled from beyond the first gate. "Why is it here?" asked the magistrix. Her voice sounded calm, but Sabriel felt the charter symbols gathering in her voice, forming on her tongue, symbols that would unleash lightning and flame the destructive powers of the earth. "It's not obviously malign, nor has it attempted any actual harm," replied Sabriel slowly, just like I did, her mind working over the possibilities. She was used to explaining purely necromantic aspects of magic to Miss Greenwood. The magistrix had taught her charter magic, but necromancy was definitely not on the syllabus. Sabriel had learned more than she wanted to know about necromancy from her father and the dead themselves. "Don't do anything for a moment," I will attempt to speak with it. Your entertainment starts stressing you. Like top 10%. Not giving a fuck. Yeah, I'm pretty good at perfecting the art of not giving a fuck. I think for the most part. But yeah, I do have a conscience as fade away, calm down. It's nothing serious. Yep. I need a drink. It's getting serious now. A cold washed over her again, biting onto her as the rougher river gushed around her legs, eager to pull her over and carry her away. Sabriel exerted her will, and the cold became simply a sensation, without danger, a current merely a pleasing vibration about her feet. The creature was close now, as it was in the living world. Sabriel held out both her hands and clapped, the sharp sound echoing for longer than it would anywhere else. Before the echo died, Sabriel whistled several notes, and they echoed too, sweet sounds within the harshness of the handclap. The thing flinched at the sound and stepped back, putting both hands on its ears. As it did so, it dropped the sack. Sabriel stared in surprise. She hadn't noticed the sack before, possibly because she hadn't expected it to be there. Very few inanimate things existed in both realms, the living and the dead. She was even more surprised as the creature suddenly bent forward and plunged into the water, hands searching for the sack. It found it almost at once, but not without losing its footing. As the sack surfaced, the current forced the creature under. Sabriel breathed a sigh of relief as she saw it slide away, and then gasped as its head broke the surface, and it cried out, "Sabriel, my messenger, take the sack." The voice was Abhorsen's. Sabriel ran forward, and an arm pushed out towards her. The neck of the sack clutched in its fingers. She reached out, missed, and then tried again. The sack was securely in her grasp. As the current took the creature completely under, Sabriel looked after it, hearing the roar of the first gate suddenly increase, as it always did when someone passed its falls. She turned and started the slog back against the current to the point where she could easily return to life. The sack in her hands was heavy, and there was a leading feeling in her stomach. I get leadening feeling in her stomach. If the messenger was truly Abhorsen's, then he himself was unable to return to the realm of the living, and that meant he was either dead or trapped by something that should have passed beyond the final gate. Once again, the wave of nausea overcame her, and Sabriel felt her knees shaking. She could feel the magistrate's hand on her shoulder, but her attention was fastened on the sack she held in her hand. She didn't need to look to know that the creature was gone. Its manifestation into the living world had ceased as its spirit had gone past the first gate. Only a pile of grave mold would remain. It would to be swept aside in the morning. "What did you do?" asked the magistrix. As Sabriel brushed her hands through her hair, ice crystals falling from her hands onto the sack that lay in front of her knees. "It had a message for me," replied Sabriel. "So I took it." She opened the sack and reached inside. A sword hilt met her grasp, so she drew it out, still scabbarded, and put it to one side. She didn't need to draw to see the charter symbols etched on its blade, along its blade, the dull emerald in its pommel, and the well-worn bronze-plated crossguard were as familiar to her as the school's uninspired cutlery. It was Abhorsen's sword. A leather bandolier she drew out next was an old brown belt and hand's brethren width, which always smelled faintly of beeswax. 7 tubular leather pouches hung from it, starting with one the size of a small pill bottle, growing larger till the 7th was almost the size of a jar. The bandolier was designed to be worn across the chest with the pouches. Oh my gosh, I don't have my picture on. I can't believe I haven't had this on. Oh my gosh. That's so pathetic. Okay, yeah, this is what I'm reading over here. See? Yeah, right there. Oh, the bandolier was designed to be worn across the chest with the pouches hanging down. Sabriel opened the smallest and pulled out the tiny silver bell with a dark, deeply polished mahogany handle. She held it gently, but the clapper still swung slightly, and the bell made a high, sweet note that somehow lingered in the mind, even after the sound was gone. "Father's instruments," whispered Sabriel, "the tools of a necromancer." "But there are charter marks engraved on the bell, and the handle," interjected the magistrix, who was looking down with fascination. "Necromancy is free magic, not governed by the charter." "Father's was different," replied Sabriel, distantly. Still staring at the bell she held in her hand, thinking of her father's brown linen hands holding the bells. Binding, not raising. He was a faithful servant of the charter. "You're going to be leaving us, aren't you?" said the magistrate, said suddenly, as Sabriel replaced the bell and stood up, sword in one hand, bandolier in the other. "I just saw it in the reflection of your bell." "Oh, sorry. I just saw it in the reflection of your bell. You were crossing the wall." "Yes, into the old kingdom," said Sabriel without realization. "Something has happened to my father, but I'll find him. So I swear by the charter I bear." She touched the charter mark on her forehead, which glowed briefly and then faded so that it might never have been seen. The magistrix nodded and touched a hand to her own forehead, where a glowing mark suddenly obscured all the patterns of time. As it faded, rustling noises and faint whispers began to sound along both sides of the dormitory. "I'll shut the doors and explain to the girls," said the magistrix, firmly. "You'd better go and prepare for tomorrow." Sabriel nodded and left, trying to fix her mind on the practicalities of the journey, rather than on what could have happened to her father. She would take a cab as early as possible into Bain, the nearest town, and then a bus to the Anastair. I knew that freaking word. I keep messing that word up. and Celestier perimeter that faced the wall. With luck, she would be there by early afternoon. Behind these plans, her thoughts just kept jumping back to Abhorsen. What could have happened to trap him in death, and what could she really hope to do about it, even if she did get to the Old Kingdom?